You are listening to HOA Craze. She treated my car like community property. Put your phone down and listen to me. That is what Amy Gray yelled at me the second I stepped out of my house, and I knew right then this was not going to be a normal Tuesday. She had a little orange warning cone in one hand and a handheld plate scanner in the other, screen turned away so I could not see it, and she was marching toward my car like she owned the entire street. I live in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, in a neighborhood called Parkside Reserve Association, and I work as a notary public, which means I document everything. Amy is the communications director for the HOA, which means she controls every email blast and neighborhood message, and she has made it very clear that she does not like me. She planted that cone right next to my driver's side front wheel, stepped back, and screamed that the cone made the tow official. I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "Your vehicle has been parked in the same spot for 24 hours without moving. That is abandonment. I have already contacted the tow vendor, and they are en route. You should have read the rules before you moved in, sweetheart." I felt my jaw tighten because I knew exactly what she was doing. My car had been parked in my own driveway, not on the street, not in a guest spot, in my own assigned space, and it had not moved because I had worked from home yesterday and today. I host a family event this weekend, and the last thing I need is some manufactured parking drama threatening my refinance timeline, which closes in 2 weeks. Any lien threat on my property could blow the entire deal. I pulled out my phone and started recording, holding it low with the screen turned away so she could not see what I was doing, and I said, "You are saying my car is abandoned because it did not move for 1 day." She said, "Correct. Section 12-4 of the parking addendum clearly states that any vehicle remaining stationary for more than 24 hours may be deemed abandoned and subject to immediate removal. I have all day, and so does my fine meter." I said, "Show me that section in writing." She held up the scanner like it was a weapon and said, "I do not need to show you anything. I am enforcing the rules. If you have a problem, you can file a complaint with the board, but the tow is happening regardless." I kept my voice steady and said, "This is my assigned parking space. My car is not blocking anything. There is no safety issue. You are inventing a violation." She said, "I am not inventing anything. The rules are the rules. You want to argue, you can argue with the tow driver when he gets here." She turned and walked toward the street, pulling out her phone, and I heard her say, "Yeah, it is Amy. The address is confirmed. Come ahead." I stood there for a second, letting the wind slam my car door shut behind me, and I realized she was serious. She was actually calling a tow truck to my driveway because my car had not moved in a day. I looked at the cone, a cheap plastic thing with a faded reflective stripe, and I thought about how insane this was. I pulled up the HOA Covenant PDF on my phone and started scrolling because I keep digital copies of everything, and I could not find any Section 12-4 about abandoned vehicles in driveways. The parking addendum mentioned guest parking and street parking, but nothing about assigned spaces. I took a screenshot, added it to a folder I had started 2 months ago when Amy first started targeting me, and I walked back into my house to grab my laptop and my notary stamp kit because I had a feeling this was going to escalate fast. Amy had started this war the day I moved in. I bought my house in Parkside Reserve 6 months ago because it was close to my clients and the property had good bones. The HOA seemed normal at first, mostly retired folks and young families, but Amy runs the communications and she treats every rule like it is carved in stone. The first issue was guest parking. I had a client visit for a signing appointment, and I told them to park in the guest lot near the clubhouse. Amy sent me an email an hour later saying guest parking required a 48-hour advance permit request and my guest was in violation. I apologized, said I did not know, and asked where to find the permit form. She replied with a link to a 60-page document and said ignorance is not an excuse. The second issue was my trash cans. I put them out the night before pickup because I leave early for work, and she sent me a photo of my cans with a timestamp and said they were visible before 6 a.m., which violated the curb appeal standards. I moved them. The third issue was my mailbox. I had replaced the post because the old one was rotting, and she said the new post was half an inch taller than the approved design, and I needed to repaint it to match the neighborhood palette. I ignored that one because it was ridiculous, and that is when she started showing up in person. The tow truck pulled up 10 minutes later, a big white flatbed with amber lights flashing, and the driver stepped out wearing a reflective vest and work boots. Amy walked over to him immediately, pointing at my car and waving her scanner around, and I could see her talking fast. The driver, a guy in his 40s with a shaved head and a calm expression, nodded a few times and then looked over at me. I walked down the driveway and said, "Hey, I am the owner. What is going on?" He said, "Ma'am here says the vehicle is abandoned and needs to be towed per HOA contract." I said, "It is not abandoned. It is parked in my assigned space. I own this house." Amy cut in and said, "The HOA has a standing contract with this vendor for enforcement. You do not get to override that." The driver looked uncomfortable and said, "I need to see the authorization paperwork. If it is in an assigned space and the owner is present, I usually do not tow unless there is a lien or a court order." Amy pulled a folded paper from her blazer pocket and handed it to him. I could not see what it said, but she said, "This is the standing authorization. The vehicle meets the criteria. Proceed." The driver read it, looked at my car, looked at me, and said, "This says vehicles in violation of parking rules. Is this spot a violation?" I said, "No, this is my driveway, my assigned space. There is no violation." Amy said, "The vehicle has not moved in over 24 hours. That is the violation." The driver said, "That is not on the authorization. I need something that says this specific vehicle is in violation right now." Amy's face went red, and she said, "I just told you it is in violation. I have the scanner data. I have the timeline. You are contracted to remove vehicles I flag." The driver said, "I am contracted to remove vehicles that are illegally parked or blocking access. I am not contracted to remove cars from private driveways because they did not move. If you want me to tow this, you need a lien notice or a court order." Amy started yelling. She said, "I am the communications director of this HOA, and I am telling you this vehicle is abandoned under our rules. If you refuse to tow it, I will report you to the management company, and we will terminate the contract." The driver looked at me, then at her, and said, "Ma'am, I am not towing a car out of someone's driveway without proper legal documentation. You want to file a complaint? Go ahead, but I am not doing it." He folded the paper, handed it back to her, and walked back to his truck. Amy stood there with her mouth open, and I could see her hands shaking. The driver pulled away, and she turned to me and said, "This is not over. You just made this so much worse for yourself." She picked up her cone, grabbed her scanner, and walked back to her car, which was parked 3 houses down. I watched her leave, and then I went inside and backed up the video to my cloud storage, because I knew this was going to get worse. I sent a quick email to my mortgage broker, letting her know there might be some HOA noise in the next 2 weeks, and she replied within an hour, saying any lien filing or unresolved violation could delay closing, and I needed to handle it immediately. That lit a fire under me, because I had already packed half my office and scheduled the movers. I could not let Amy derail this. I spent the rest of the evening reading the HOA covenants, the parking addendum, and every board meeting minute I could find on the resident portal. There was no Section 12-4. There was no 24-hour abandonment rule for assigned spaces. The only mention of abandoned vehicles was in the guest lot, and it required 7 days of non-movement plus a visible notice before towing. I screenshotted every relevant page, highlighted the sections, and saved them in a folder labeled Evidence. Then I went to the neighborhood Facebook group and searched Amy's name. What I found made my stomach drop. She had been posting about me for 2 months. She never used my name directly, but the details were obvious. She had written things like, "Some residents think the rules do not apply to them," and, "When someone moves in and immediately starts ignoring basic standards, it sets a bad precedent." There were a dozen posts, all passive-aggressive, all clearly about me. Other residents had liked them and commented with supportive messages, and I realized she had been building a narrative. She was painting me as the problem neighbor, the guy who does not follow the rules, the outsider who does not respect the community. It was a setup. The next morning, I got an email from the HOA management company. It was titled Violation Notice, and it had an attachment. The email said I was in violation of Parking Standards Section 8-2, which covered guest parking abuse, and Section 11-1, which covered unapproved modifications to common area-facing structures. The fine was $250 due within 10 days, and failure to pay would result in a lien filing. I opened the attachment and saw a photo of my car and my driveway, taken from the street, with a timestamp of yesterday afternoon. There was also a photo of my mailbox post with a ruler held next to it, showing it was half an inch taller than some invisible standard. I replied to the management company and said, "I am not in violation of guest parking. My car is in my assigned space. I am not in violation of mailbox standards." I replaced a rotting post with an identical design. "Please provide the specific rule text that supports these claims." The management company replied 2 hours later and said, "These violations were reported by the HOA communications director and are subject to board review. If you wish to dispute them, you may request a hearing at the next board meeting. The fine stands pending resolution." I looked at the calendar. The next board meeting was in 2 weeks, the same week as my closing. I could not wait that long. I needed to shut this down now. I called a friend of mine, Rachel, who lives 4 houses down and has been in the neighborhood for 5 years. She is a calm, smart woman who brought her kids to my housewarming and warned me that Amy could be difficult. I told her what was happening, and she said, "Oh no, she is doing the targeting thing again. She did this to another guy 2 years ago. He had a work van, and she said it was commercial use and tried to get him fined every week until he sold his house." I said, "What happened to him?" Rachel said, "He moved. He could not deal with it anymore. She made his life miserable. But listen, you have something he did not. You have proof. If you can show the board that she is lying about the rules, they will back off. They do not want a lawsuit." I said, "How do I get in front of the board before the meeting?" She said, "You do not, but you can email every homeowner directly. The HOA has to publish the member directory. You can send your evidence to everyone and force them to see what she is doing. If enough people push back, the board will drop it to avoid bad press." That made sense. I pulled up the directory, exported the email list, and started drafting a message. I kept it factual, calm, and professional. I attached the covenant sections that disproved Amy's claims. I included screenshots of her Facebook posts, and I included the video of her threatening the tow driver. I wrote, "I am sharing this because I believe in transparency and accountability. The violations I have been accused of do not exist in the HOA rules, and I have documented evidence to prove it. I hope the board will review this matter fairly." I hit send at 9 p.m., and I watched the delivery confirmations roll in. The response was immediate. My phone started buzzing with replies. Some people thanked me for speaking up. Some people said they had experienced similar treatment from Amy. One person sent me a spreadsheet that had been circulating privately among a few board members, and when I opened it, I felt my blood turn cold. It was a target list. There were 6 addresses highlighted in yellow, and mine was one of them. Next to each address was a column labeled Priority and a column labeled Strategy. My row said Priority High and Strategy Guest Parking, Mailbox, Vehicle Movement, Escalate to Lean if needed. Another address said Priority Medium and Strategy Lawn Height, Trash Cans, Noise Complaints. It was a hunting list. Amy had been systematically targeting specific residents, and the board knew about it. I forwarded the spreadsheet to Rachel and said, "Did you know about this?" She replied, "No." "Oh my god, this is insane. You have to take this to the meeting. If the board sees that this leaked, they will panic." I said, "The meeting is too far out. I need to move faster." She said, "Then go to the management company in person. Demand an emergency hearing. Bring everything. Make them choose between you and Amy." I drove to the management company office the next morning. It was a small building in a strip mall, generic and beige, with a receptionist who looked surprised when I walked in without an appointment. I said, "I need to speak to whoever handles Parkside Reserve Association. It is urgent." She made a call, and a woman in her 50s came out, introduced herself as Linda, and said, "What is this about?" I said, "I am being targeted by the HOA communications director with false violations, and I have evidence that there is a coordinated effort to force me out. I need an emergency hearing before my mortgage closing gets derailed." Linda looked uncomfortable and said, "We do not typically do emergency hearings unless there is a safety issue or a lawsuit filing." I pulled out my folder, opened it on her desk, and said, "Here is the covenant text that proves the violations are fake. Here is video of the communications director threatening an illegal tow. Here is a leaked spreadsheet showing a target list with my address marked high priority. If this goes to court, your company is going to be named as a co-defendant for enabling harassment. I would rather resolve this now." Linda read through the documents, her face going pale, and she said, "Where did you get this spreadsheet?" I said, "It was sent to me by another homeowner. I assume it leaked from a board email." She said, "This is a disaster. If this is real, we have a liability problem. Let me make some calls. Can you wait here for 20 minutes? I said yes and sat in the waiting area. 30 minutes later, Linda came back and said, "I spoke to the board president. We are scheduling an emergency review session tomorrow at 6 p.m. You will have 15 minutes to present your case. The board will vote on whether to dismiss the violations. Amy will not be present because this is about her conduct." I said, "What about the fine?" she said. The fine is suspended pending the hearing. If the board rules in your favor, it will be voided. If not, it stands. I said, fair enough. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I printed every document, organized them into a binder with tabs, and rehearsed my talking points. Rachel offered to come as a witness, and I said yes. I also reached out to 2 other neighbors who had replied to my email saying they had similar experiences, and they agreed to submit written statements. I kept my voice low when I told Rachel about my trump card, because my trump card needed perfect timing. I had one more piece of evidence I had not shared yet, and I was saving it for the moment when Amy tried to spin this as a misunderstanding. The hearing was in a conference room at the management company office. The board president, a retired engineer named Tom, was there, along with 2 other board members I did not recognize. Linda sat in the corner with a laptop, taking notes. I walked in with my binder, and Rachel followed me. Tom said, "Thank you for coming. We have reviewed your email and the documents you provided. We want to hear your side before we make a decision." I opened my binder and walked them through it. I showed them the covenant sections that disproved the parking violation. I showed them the timeline proving my car was in my assigned space. I showed them the video of Amy threatening the tow driver. I showed them the spreadsheet with the target list. I said, "This is not about rules enforcement. This is about a coordinated harassment campaign, and I have proof that it is personal." Tom looked at the spreadsheet and said, "Where did you get this?" I said, "It was sent to me by another homeowner. I do not know where it originated, but the metadata shows it was created on the HOA board shared drive." One of the other board members, a woman in her 60s, said, "This is deeply concerning. If this document is real, it suggests improper conduct by HOA leadership." Tom said, "We will investigate the origin of this document. In the meantime, what do you want from us?" I said, "I want the violations dismissed. I want a written statement that I am not in violation of any parking or mailbox rules. I want the fine voided, and I want assurance that I will not be targeted again." Tom nodded and said, "We will take a vote. Linda, can you call Amy and ask her to join us by phone so she can respond to these allegations?" Linda dialed and put the call on speaker. Amy answered, and Tom said, "Amy, we are in an emergency hearing regarding violations you reported for the property at AS on Ashen. The homeowner has provided evidence that contradicts your claims and has alleged harassment. Can you explain the basis for the violations?" Amy's voice came through sharp and defensive. She said, "The violations are legitimate. The vehicle was not moving, which indicates abandonment. The mailbox was modified without approval. I followed the enforcement protocol exactly as written." I said, "There is no abandonment rule for assigned spaces. I have the covenant right here. Section 8-2 only applies to guest lots, and it requires 7 days plus notice. You claimed 24 hours and no notice." Amy said, "I interpreted the rule based on the intent of maintaining active use of parking spaces." Tom said, "Interpretation is not the same as enforcement. The rules are written clearly. If they do not cover this situation, you cannot create a violation." Amy said, "I was acting in the best interest of the community. If residents are allowed to park indefinitely without moving, it creates a stagnant appearance." I said, "My car was in my driveway for 1 day because I worked from home. That is not stagnant. That is normal life." The board member woman said, "Amy, can you explain the target list document that was provided? It shows 6 properties marked for escalation, including this one." Amy went silent for a second and then said, "I do not know what document you are referring to." I said, "It is a spreadsheet titled Compliance Focus, created on the HOA shared drive, with properties listed by priority and strategy. My address is marked high priority, with a strategy that includes guest parking, mailbox, vehicle movement, and escalation to lien." Amy said, "That document was a draft. It was never meant to be official. It was just my notes on properties that needed attention." Tom said, "Notes or not, it suggests you were targeting specific homeowners for escalation regardless of actual violations. That is not acceptable." Amy said, "I was doing my job. If people do not like enforcement, they should not live in an HOA." I kept my voice low and said, "I have one more thing." I pulled out my phone, opened the audio app, and said, "This is a recording from a conversation I had with a tow yard manager yesterday. I called the vendor you use and asked why they refused to tow my car. He told me you called him back after the driver left and said, and I quote, 'I do not care what the rules say. I want that car gone because he has been a problem since day one and I want to make an example of him.' That is personal targeting, not rules enforcement." I hit play. The audio was clean. The tow yard manager's voice said, "Yeah." She called back and was pretty heated. She said she did not care what the driver thought. She wanted the car towed because the owner had been a problem since he moved in, and she wanted to make an example. I told her we do not do personal vendettas, we only do legal tows, and she hung up on me. The room went dead silent. Tom said, "Amy, is that accurate?" Amy said, "I may have been frustrated, but I did not mean it that way." Tom said, "That is a clear admission of personal intent. You just said on a recorded line that you wanted to make an example of a homeowner. That is not enforcement, that is harassment." The board member woman said, "I move that we dismiss all violations against this property and issue a formal apology. I also move that we open an investigation into Amy's conduct as communications director." The other board member, a man in his 50s, said, "I second that." Tom said, "All in favor." 3 hands went up. He said, "The violations are dismissed. The fine is voided. We will follow up with you in writing. Amy, we will be scheduling a board executive session to discuss your role. This call is over." He hung up. I sat there for a second, letting it sink in, and then I said, "Thank you." Tom said, "I apologize for what you have been through. This should not have happened. We will make sure it does not happen again." Rachel and I walked out of the building, and she hugged me and said, "You just dismantled her. That audio was perfect." I said, "I knew she would say something stupid if I pushed the right button. I just had to make sure I had it recorded when she did." The fallout happened fast. The board sent me a formal letter 2 days later saying the violations were dismissed, the fine was voided, and they were conducting a review of enforcement policies. Amy was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded. Amy had posted a long complaint about how the board was attacking her for doing her job and how some residents were weaponizing the system, but the post got removed by the group admin and replaced with a correction saying the board had found her enforcement actions improper and she was under review. A dozen people commented thanking me for standing up, and a few others shared their own stories of being targeted by her. A week later, the board scheduled a special meeting to vote on Amy's future. I did not attend because I had already said my piece, but Rachel went and texted me updates. The board reviewed the audio, the spreadsheet, the timeline, and the complaints from other homeowners. They voted unanimously to remove Amy from the communications director role and bar her from holding any HOA leadership position for 5 years. The vote happened mid-discussion when Amy tried to interrupt and explain herself, and the board voted anyway, cutting her off. Rachel said it was the most satisfying thing she had ever seen. The management company also launched a budget review to see if there were any other issues with vendor relationships. What they found was a mess. Amy had been funneling all towing and landscaping contracts to vendors who gave her personal kickbacks in the form of gift cards and discounted services for her own property. The tow vendor had been charging the HOA inflated rates and splitting the extra with her. When the city compliance office got a copy of the budget review, they opened their own investigation, and the tow vendor lost their city contract and had to refund every improper tow from the past 2 years. The HOA dropped the vendor immediately to avoid further liability, and Amy ended up with a cease and desist letter from the management company threatening legal action if she tried to interfere with HOA business again. My refinance closed on time, with no issues. My mortgage broker sent me a congratulations email with a note that said, "I do not know what you did, but that HOA noise disappeared fast. Good work." I moved my office into the new space, set up my notary station, and got back to work. The neighborhood felt different. People waved when I drove past. A few neighbors brought over cookies and said they were glad someone finally stood up to Amy. Rachel invited me to a block party and introduced me to the new communications director, a retired teacher who promised to focus on actual community building instead of enforcement campaigns. The mailbox cluster became the spot where everyone gathered to talk and watch for drama, and for a while, that drama was Amy. She tried to keep a low profile, but every time she walked to her car, someone would make a comment or take a photo. One afternoon, I was checking my mail, and I saw her coming down the sidewalk with her scanner and her clipboard, and I just smiled and waved. She looked away and kept walking. A neighbor standing next to me said, "You broke her." I said no, I just made her follow the rules she pretended to care about. The board implemented new policies to prevent future abuse. They required all enforcement actions to include a written citation with the specific rule section cited, a photo with timestamp, and a 7-day cure period before any fine. They also required all vendor contracts to go through a competitive bid process with at least 3 quotes, and they banned any board member from having a financial relationship with vendors. The new communications director sent a newsletter explaining the changes and included a line that said, "Enforcement is about safety and standards, not personal agendas. We are committed to fair and transparent processes for all residents." It felt like a reset. I kept the evidence folder on my laptop and backed it up to 3 locations because I learned that paper trails are the only thing that matters when someone decides to target you. I also started attending board meetings, not because I wanted to be involved in HOA drama, but because I wanted to make sure no one else got targeted the way I did. Rachel joined me, and we became the unofficial accountability committee, the people who asked questions when something did not make sense, and who kept copies of every vote and every budget line. Amy eventually moved out. She listed her house 6 months after the board vote, and it sold fast. I heard through Rachel that she told the realtor she was relocating for family reasons, but everyone knew the truth. She could not handle being the person everyone side-eyed at the grocery store, the person whose name became shorthand for HOA overreach. The day the moving truck pulled up to her house, I was working in my home office, and I saw it through the window. I did not go outside. I did not wave. I just watched her load boxes and drive away, and I felt relieved that the chapter was over. The tow vendor fallout became a minor news story in the local paper. A reporter reached out to me for a comment, and I declined, but I sent her copies of the budget review and the city compliance findings. She wrote a piece titled "Local HOA Tow Vendor Loses City Contract After Improper Charges," and it ran with a quote from the city saying they were reviewing all vendor contracts for similar issues. The vendor went out of business 3 months later, and the owner posted a bitter rant on social media, blaming the HOA and the city for ruining his livelihood. I did not feel bad. He had been running a predatory operation for years, and the only reason it stopped was because someone finally called it out. Rachel and I became close friends. She invited me to neighborhood cookouts and introduced me to people who had been too nervous to talk to me before because they did not want to get on Amy's bad side. I learned that a lot of residents had been afraid to speak up, afraid that they would be the next target, afraid that their property values would drop if they caused trouble. It was a culture of fear, and Amy had built it deliberately. Breaking that culture took time, but it started with one person refusing to back down, and then another, and then another. The new HOA board worked well. They focused on actual maintenance and safety issues instead of manufactured violations. They repaved the roads, fixed the clubhouse roof, and organized a community garden that people actually used. The meetings became shorter and less contentious. People stopped showing up with lawyers and recordings because they did not need to. The board started publishing meeting minutes online within 48 hours, and they created a suggestion box where residents could submit ideas anonymously. It felt like a functional community instead of a surveillance state. If you are enjoying this story, hit that like button and subscribe for more HOA revenge tales where the paper trail wins. I kept my notary business running smooth, and I started getting referrals from other Parkside Reserve residents who needed documents signed or witnessed. A few of them mentioned that they trusted me because I had stood up to Amy, and that felt good. I did not set out to be the neighborhood hero. I just wanted to close my refinance and live my life. But sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone who did not have the tools or the courage to fight back. The parking cone that started it all ended up in my garage. I kept it as a reminder that sometimes the most absurd moments turn into the most important battles. Every time I see it, I think about how close I came to just paying the fine and moving on, and how different everything would have been if I had. Amy would still be targeting people, the tow vendor would still be running scams, the board would still be ignoring complaints. One stupid orange cone, planted by my wheel with a scream that it made the tow official, became the thing that broke an entire system. I learned a lot from that fight. I learned that HOAs rely on fear and confusion to enforce rules that do not exist. I learned that most people will not fight back because they assume the HOA knows something they do not. I learned that documentation is the most powerful weapon you have, and that a calm voice with a recording device is more dangerous than any angry confrontation. I learned that bullies like Amy count on silence, and the second you refuse to stay silent, their power evaporates. The refinance money let me upgrade my notary equipment and expand my client base, and I started doing mobile signings for real estate closings all over Chapel Hill. Every time I drove into a new neighborhood with an HOA, I made a point to ask the seller if they had ever had enforcement issues. Most of them said no, but a few of them told stories that sounded exactly like mine, and I always gave them my card and said, if you ever need help documenting something, call me. I became the guy who knew how to fight back, and that felt right. The neighborhood settled into a rhythm, people planted flowers, kids played in the street, the board approved a new playground near the clubhouse, and everyone showed up for the ribbon cutting. Amy's house sold to a young couple with a baby, and they fit in immediately. They had no idea what had happened before they moved in, and I did not tell them. It was not their story to carry. Rachel and I still meet at the mailbox cluster once a week, usually on Thursdays, and we catch up on whatever is happening. The drama is small now, the kind of normal neighbor stuff that does not require lawyers or recordings. Someone's dog got loose, someone's sprinkler is broken. Someone wants to organize a holiday decoration contest. It is boring, and boring is exactly what I wanted. I still see the tow yard manager sometimes when I drive past the industrial park where his office used to be. The building is empty now, with a for lease sign in the window. I think about how many people he towed over the years, how many people paid the fees because they did not know they could fight back, how many people just accepted it as the cost of living in an HOA. I am glad I did not accept it. I am glad I made the call, recorded the conversation, and used it when it mattered most. The audio clip where Karen admits it is personal and she wants to make an example of me became the thing that flipped the power dynamic completely. The board could not ignore it. The management company could not spin it. Amy could not walk it back. It was her own words, recorded by a neutral third party, proving intent. I showed the tow yard the paperwork and they refused to keep cooperating with the HOA, and that cut off Amy's leverage completely. No tow vendor meant no tow threats. No tow threats meant no way to force instant payments. The whole enforcement machine collapsed because one person refused to play along. The final board meeting where they voted Amy out was the turning point for the entire neighborhood. She tried to interrupt, and the meeting voted anyway, cutting her off mid-sentence, and the room went silent except for the sound of hands going up. 3 votes. Unanimous. Done. Rachel said people actually clapped when the vote was announced, and Amy walked out without saying another word. Her group post got removed and replaced with a correction that said, "The board has determined that recent enforcement actions did not comply with HOA policies and has taken corrective action. Residents with concerns are encouraged to contact the management company directly." The HOA dropped the case to avoid a public records mess. Linda from the management company told me privately that they were terrified I would file a lawsuit and demand discovery, which would expose every email, every vendor contract, and every targeting decision Amy had made. They wanted it to go away, and the fastest way to make it go away was to admit fault and move on. I did not push for more because I got what I needed, the violations dismissed, the fine voided, and Amy removed. Anything beyond that would have been about revenge, and I did not need revenge. I needed peace. The budget review that revealed vendor favoritism became the thing that forced real change. The board could not ignore it once the numbers were laid out. Amy had been approving invoices for work that was never done, approving rate increases that were not justified, and steering contracts to vendors who gave her perks. The tow vendor was the worst offender, charging $300 for tows that should have cost $150, and splitting the difference with Amy in the form of gift cards and free towing for her own vehicle. The city compliance office flagged it as a kickback scheme, and the vendor lost their license. The HOA got a partial refund and switched to a new vendor who bid competitively and followed the rules. I kept working, I kept documenting, I kept living my life. The family event I hosted went perfectly. No drama, no surprise tow trucks, no Amy showing up with a cone and a scanner. My relatives parked in the guest lot with proper permits, my driveway stayed clear, and we had a great weekend. My uncle asked me why I looked so relaxed, and I said, because I finally do not have to watch my back every time I park my car. The parking enforcement abuse that defined my first 6 months in Parkside Reserve became a story I told other people as a warning and a blueprint. I met a guy at a notary conference who lived in an HOA in Durham, and he told me his board was threatening to tow his work truck because they said it was commercial use. I walked him through exactly what I did: document everything, record everything, find the covenant text, email everyone, and force the board to choose between backing down and facing exposure. He followed the steps and the board dropped the case within a week. He sent me a thank you email with a photo of his truck still parked in his driveway, and he said, "You just saved me thousands of dollars and months of stress." That is what this fight taught me. It is not just about winning your own case. It is about showing other people that they can win too. HOAs count on isolation. They count on you thinking you are the only one with a problem, the only one being targeted, the only one who does not understand the rules. The second you break that isolation and show people the pattern, the whole system changes. Amy targeted 6 properties before someone finally fought back hard enough to expose her. How many more would she have targeted if I had not? I do not regret any of it. I do not regret the hours spent reading covenants. I do not regret the confrontation with the tow driver. I do not regret the emergency hearing or the audio recording or the email blast to every homeowner. I regret that it had to happen at all, but I do not regret how I handled it. I stayed calm. I stayed factual. I stayed within the law. I used the system against the people who were abusing it, and I won. The orange cone is still in my garage, tucked in a corner behind some paint cans. Sometimes I look at it and laugh, sometimes I think about throwing it away, but I keep it because it reminds me that even the smallest, stupidest thing can become the catalyst for something bigger. Amy set that cone by my wheel and screamed that it made the tow official, and in a way, she was right. It made everything official. It made the fight real. It made me realize I had to document every second, gather every piece of evidence, and prepare for war, and I did. And I won. The tow vendor is gone. Amy is gone. The fear is gone. The neighborhood is better. My refinance closed. My business is thriving. My parking space is mine. And no one is ever going to plant a cone by my wheel again. That is the payoff. That is the victory. Not just for me, but for everyone who was too afraid to fight back before someone showed them it was possible. I will catch you in the next story.